So, in this video, I want to talk about the War Cabinet, the British War Cabinet in 1917, during the First World War. So, the Asquith government coalition had effectively collapsed in December of 1916. So, with this collapse, the Labour government was able to retain power, but to do so they had to broaden the coalition, and Asquith had to go. So Herbert Asquith left government, resigned, and was replaced by his Minister of Munitions, David Lloyd George, famous go-getter Welshman. Now, this change in government was greeted with enthusiasm because it was believed that Lloyd George was the man to really lead the coalition to victory. After all, this was a war of material, and it was a total war, and so it made sense to have the former Minister of Munitions as the head of the government. On the other hand, this meant a shake-up in the leadership, and it also meant that some of the lessons that had been learned by the Asquith administration were not forgotten, or had been the learning of those lessons had been mitigated somewhat by the inclusion of so many new people in the cabinet. And the result of this was that the immediate strategy of the Lloyd George government was not necessarily any more effective than the Asquith strategy had been. So, one of the things that Lloyd George wanted to do in 1917 was firstly, he endorsed the strategy that was now being pursued by his French allies, specifically the upcoming Nivelle offensive, what would become known as the Battle of Arras, in which famous, for the Canadian side, the famous Vimy Ridge battle would take place, which was the singular success of that offensive, which was otherwise a month-long catastrophe, more or less. The result of which was that the French army effectively decided that they no longer wanted to be involved in massive offensive slaughters. Now, this had been, Nivelle was able to get this plan through the government of France because his predecessor, Joffre, had resigned after the numerous failures that he had overseen. And so Nivelle, like Lloyd George, was perceived as the new man on the spot, scientific, believed in, Nivelle believed in systematic artillery bombardment and so on. Of course, again, they had not really intuited the lessons, so less than was simply needed the ability to obliterate the enemy's trenches with artillery. More what was required was the true decentralization of command, combined with the new weapons, such as the aircraft and the tank, and the new methods of utilizing artillery, especially mortars, local mortars, which are under the command of the company and battalion commanders. So this decentralization of command, the ability to infiltrate using stormtroop tactics, as the Germans developed, the enemy's trenches, to counter their artillery, less so than to simply obliterate it, which could be done with chlorine gas or smoke shells, things like these. So what historians of the army and military scientists describe as the modern system of warfare was being developed at this time. Whereas the Battle of Arras, as it was fought, was still essentially a huge set-piece battle, and Vimy is particularly indicative of this because it was just the prep that was done with mine warfare, artillery preparation was extensive, and they were only capturing a small local ridge, and not much more. And again, this really didn't get the Allies anywhere strategically because it didn't change the ultimate status of the war, which was that the Germans were still on the defensive and they could continue to be on the defensive for as long as they wanted, really, or until they were strangled by blockade. Now this is where we go back to the War Cabinet. So on the cabinet, in addition to, we're talking about Vimy, the Prime Minister of Canada, Robert Borden, is on the cabinet, but so is the First Sea Lord of the Admiralty and the First Lord. First Sea Lord is Sir John Jellicoe, who's been promoted in December, and his First Lord, the civilian Lord, is Carson. Now, Carson was picked because he had some government connections with some other powerful people in the cabinet, specifically the group that was connected with Lord Milner, who we'll talk about in just a moment, who became War Minister after, this was after the death, of course, of Lord Kitchener in, I think, November 1916, who was killed when the ship he was on a visit to Russia was sunk, either by torpedo or mine. And unfortunately, Kitchener of Khartoum, the great commander and strategist who had pulled the Allies through the first couple of years of the war, was killed. This was, I compare this to the death of Yamamoto Isakuro in World War II, when his plane is shot down. So the Germans are able to get Kitchener, but unfortunately his replacement, unfortunately for the Germans, his replacement is a virulent and dedicated war man, in this sense, Milner. Milner has, of course, had been infamous for having started the Boer War in 1900 as the representative, the governor of the Cape Colony working for Joseph Chamberlain. Milner had gone to the Cape specifically with the objective of causing a war and was able to do it. He was anyway, so his group of colleagues, though, which include many of these South African agents, such as Jan Smuts, who is also on the War Cabinet. Smuts would later play an important role as one of the creators of the Royal Air Force. His recommendations in July and August of 1917 argue that the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps, the Army and the Navy branches, should be merged together to create a single Air Force, the Royal Air Force, which was then effectively done. But anyway, so Carson works for, or he's connected, he's intimate with Milner, but his First Sea Lord is John Jellicoe. Now, John Jellicoe has just come off fighting the Battle of Jutland in about, well, 6 months prior, on May 31st and June 1st. Now, Jutland had been really a tie. The Germans, the High Seas Fleet commanded by Reinhard Scheer and his battlecruiser commander, Franz Hipper, had succeeded to a certain extent in that they had achieved one of their long-standing objectives, which was to catch a portion of the Grand Fleet, that is the Royal Navy's main battle fleet, and destroy some of it and escape their own destruction. And they had done this in that Hipper had been able to sink 2 of Vice Admiral Beatty's battlecruiser fleet, as well as a 3rd force under Hood of the HMS Invincible. Was also, another battlecruiser was sunk, to the loss for the Germans of only a single battlecruiser, which was the Lützow. So, 3-1 looks like a victory in this regard. However, the Scheer was only able to escape with his fleet by more or less luck and Jellicoe's somewhat timid approach to, or concern over the potential for mine and torpedo attacks, something he talked about extensively. So the High Seas Fleet goes back to harbor. They only come out again in August in a brief sortie in which, once again, they then return to harbor, and then this is it. They don't come out after this. So until they're ordered to commit more or less a suicide charge at the end of the war in 1918. So Jellicoe is then promoted to First Sea Lord. However, he now has a much different. He spent the last 2 years of the war as the commander of the Grand Fleet, as a fleet commander, building up the Grand Fleet and then executing its major battle at Jutland. However, he's now got quite a different task because the Germans have returned to unrestricted submarine warfare starting in October 1916, and then will continue to do so through the climax of that, which is in April 1917, until the end of the war. And now, April 1917 is also when the Americans joined the war over their repeated complaints about the excesses of the German German submarine campaign, which is destroying merchant shipping, including their own, and killing their citizens, as has happened with the Lusitania disaster in 1915. So Jellicoe now has to do something about the submarines, and the British Navy has never really solved this problem. They don't have a method for finding them, and they certainly don't have very much of a method or any method for sinking them. They've gotten lucky by ramming them occasionally, and they know that they can be spotted by aircraft and balloons, much like helicopters would do today, but they do not yet have very reliable depth charges or seeking torpedoes or things like this that would be very useful at sinking the submarines. So they need some system for solving that problem. So that's one of the challenges of the War Cabinet, and this is what Jellicoe has been brought in to do. He's created a Jellicoe is a centralizer and reformer at the naval staff, and so one of the things he does is he creates an anti-submarine division under the command of Alexander Duff, who is then set specifically with the task of solving the submarine problem. So they go to work on that. Now, another character who's in the new 1917 War Cabinet is Maurice Hankey, Lieutenant Colonel Maurice Hankey, who is the Royal Marine Artillery, I believe, and is the Secretary of the Committee of Imperial Defense and indeed the Secretary of the War Cabinet. Hankey is a very interesting figure who played many important roles in the war and in the interwar period and in the Second World War. His book is called The Supreme Command, and rightly so, as he was the secretary for all of these high-level committees and was personally there overseeing what they were doing, circulating papers and proposing ideas. He has some claim, along with Winston Churchill and Murray Suter, to having invented the tank. Hankey worked with one of Kitchener's colleagues, which was Ernest Swinton, who was a correspondent for Kitchener in 1914. And Swinton had proposed to the War Office and had sent a letter to Hankey suggesting that they build what he called as machine gun destroyers, or some system for destroying machine guns. And Swinton had worked out very carefully what those would do, but he hadn't actually designed them. And it was the Admiralty under Winston Churchill who had then got to work on actually making the machines. And Lloyd George, interestingly, of course, as the Minister of Munitions in 1915, had been involved in this process. He had worked on, he had been behind the construction of the prototype tank to some extent, and it was under his auspices that the tanks were further developed and then actually put into large-scale manufacture. Now, the way that this group of people are planning to run the war in 1917 is, in a way, a return to some extent, it's a re-exertion of the control of the civilians over the Army command. So when trench warfare had really got underway, which it starts at the first battle of Ypres in October 1914, and then carries, though only to a hesitant extent, it's a still semi-fluid environment at that time, but it really becomes entrenched over the winter. And then the second battle of Ypres, followed by the Dardanelles campaign. These are demonstrated now of what's happening, which are attempts to get around the flanks of the trenches that have developed. Now, Asquith, at the beginning of the war, or at least early in 1915, Asquith, Churchill, and Kitchener, along with Hankey and some of their associates, want to. They know that the trench warfare has become too difficult, too expensive, too costly to fight, and so they want to try to get around the flanks. And so one of the ways they try to do this is they try to disable the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, by sending, on one part of the strategy is to send special operations, in this case Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, to Arabia to try to get the Arab national revolt underway, which will disable that part of the empire, simultaneously with sending the British fleet to Constantinople, hopefully to force the Ottomans to exit the war and to reopen supplies through the Dardanelles to Russia, which is the sort of sensible purpose of this operation. Now, this is the flank strategy. Unfortunately, the flank strategy doesn't really work initially. T. Lawrence is very, very slow moving. This is guerrilla warfare; it takes a long time to pay off, and the Dardanelles campaign becomes a bit bogged down, and then a disaster. Churchill resigns, and so on. So by 1916, that the sort of flank strategy has collapsed, and Asquith just gives up. He turns control over to the army, and the army has now, under Douglas Haig, as Sir John French has moved on to become Home Defense Secretary. That is responsible for the air, trying to stop the German bombing raids that are being conducted by Zeppelins at this time. So he's turned it over to Douglas Haig, and Haig has no strategy. Haig only believes in titanic battles, and specifically in Flanders. He wants to have his own kind of Waterloo, one imagines. So the fixation on these main battles in France leads to, and in Flanders, plus the German offensive at Verdun forces the Allies to conduct their the early operation at the Somme, which is a catastrophe, although it does take some of the stress off France and Verdun. So the Germans are forced to move their forces to defend, although the Allied operation is so poorly run and run for so long that ultimately it's just a disaster. This then also leads to so this is the major Haig run catastrophe in 1916, and the response to this is the collapse of the Asquith government to some extent, and then Lloyd George comes in. Now, Lloyd George, being a material man for the Ministry of Munitions, knows that they're going to need lots of men, and they're going to need lots of material, and they're going to need lots of money for what's coming in 1917. But he also doesn't. He wants new methods. He doesn't want to go. He's seen what has happened when they just turned things over to the army, and he doesn't want to go back to that. But he also knows that they can't go fight the Dardanelles campaign again. So what he's proposing, after the so-called new methods of the Nivelle offensive fail, is an attempt to use Italy as the weak point. So he wants to move a large portion of the British Army to Italy and at the Azonzo front, at which the Italians are fighting with the Austrians and are stalemated, and hopefully tip the balance there. Now, he's also looking well, so the flank strategy has sort of come back into vogue under Lloyd George. However, he's facing a lot of opposition, especially from his different army, his commanders. So Haig doesn't want to do this, of course, because he'll lose control of a large part of his army. Meanwhile, the British fleet, now under the Grand Fleet is now under the command of David Beatty, believes that they've got a solution, which is they think that since the submarine problem is so out of hand, Beatty believes that what they might be able to do is launch a massive air torpedo attack against the high seas fleet in harbor and disable it. And then if it's disabled, then the Grand Fleet can come in for a closer blockade. Beatty's more willing to risk his ships than Jellicoe is. They can come in for a closer blockade, and then they can put the German submarine bases directly out. Those are at Zeebrugge and Ostend, directly out of commission. And if they can get the bases out of commission, then there'll be no more submarine threat. So Beatty thinks he has the solution. Of course, Haig thinks he has the solution, which is he's preparing for Ypres 3, which will be this massive operation again in the theater, which has become known as the Battle of Passchendaele. And as you know from the negative connotations that name has, it will also become a horrible nightmare and just a quagmire. But so the Army and the Navy believe they have different solutions. Now, meanwhile, the air, which is now being merged together to create the Air Ministry, the Air Ministers believe, which the first Air Minister is Lord Rothermere, though he resigns very quickly and is replaced by, I believe, Lord Weir. And his chief of the air staff is at first Trenchard, but Trenchard can't get along with Rothermere, so he resigns, and he's replaced by Frederick Sykes, another Royal Marine. So they believe that the Air Ministry now believes that they have the solution, which is that they're going to strategically bomb. They're going to set up an independent organization under Trenchard, which will do strategic bombing against German cities, and their morale will collapse. This is really the beginning of the morale bombing strategy, which has been used by air forces almost ever since. So Lloyd George has to decide how is he going to, and this is in addition, I should add, to the small group of futurists, including J.F.C. Fuller, Basil Littlehart, and Hugh Ellis, who are proposing that they should stop all of this nonsense and build a big tank army and use that to roll over the enemy. So all of these different groups are now competing with each other for how they want to solve the war problem, and Lloyd George has to decide how to do it. Now, unfortunately, he really can't say no to Douglas Haig. So, as Leon Wolfe has pointed out in his book about Flanders Field, they do Ypres. They go and they fight Ypres and again Ypres 3, and Haig is able to sort of sell this because he argues that they'll break through, of course, and they'll cut up to the coast, and then the army will be able to get the submarine bases. So you see, that will solve the submarine problem, which the Navy, of course, was unable to solve. Now, however, this is not technically, what's actually happening by this point is that the Navy has solved the problem because they've gone to a convoy system, and the convoy system does work in the sense that it protects the merchant shipping, and it forces the submarines to come fight the convoys. And when they go to fight the convoys, they're then vulnerable and they can be attacked by air and destroyers. So the submarine problem is being reduced at this point. However, the international situation for the War Cabinet has become quite serious. Russia, the Russian front has collapsed, and there's been a revolution, and the provisional government is now being threatened by the communists, and they eventually signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which ends the war in Russia, and this frees up, it gives enormous land to the German Second Reich, and it also frees up their armed forces to move to the west, which they then do, and then Ludendorff fights the famous Michael offensive, the Spring Offensive, which comes very close to winning the war, proving that the Germans were not as beat down as was being claimed by both the British Navy, who said the blockade was winning it, and by the Air Ministry, which said that their strategic bombing was winning it, and by the Army, which said that its big battles were winning it. So we have to be very careful, we have to question very carefully Lloyd George's running of the war after he takes power in 1917, and the War Cabinet of 1917, although it contains these very powerful luminary individuals, and it's quite large, is a prototype for the kind of modern National Security Council or think tank like this. Though to some extent the Committee of Imperial Defense had been like that as well. But this is a much larger and more disciplinary body, the War Cabinet. However, the successes of the War Cabinet are very questionable. And we'd be wise to, again, to be skeptical about their initial success. The victory in 1918, to some extent, can be chalked up more to the exhaustion of the German army than it can to all the preceding successes of or battles that had been fought by the Allies up to that time.